And our polling that we commissioned with GQR Research after the election showed that voters were very concerned about public services, but specifically, as the arrows indicate on this chart, that support for ending the restriction on pay increases to public. So we saw 76% of voters felt either very strongly or somewhat strongly that they wanted to see an end to the government's public sector pay policy. And that included a lot of Conservative voters as well. And more recently, has made this point as well. So this, what I want to draw your attention to here is polling by Lord Ashcroft that again showed very high levels of awarding pay rises above the current 1% cap. Now, that support is very strong for some public sector workers. So we see in the left-hand chart here, very strong support for breaking the pay cap for nurses, prison and police officers and armed forces. And again, strong support amongst Conservative voters there. It's a little bit more nuanced for other public sector workers. So the majority of the general public still supported breaking the cap for doctors, teachers, and immigration and border control staff, although Conservative voters seem less certain on that. And unfortunately, we see only less than half the general public supporting breaking the cap for civil servants, which I thought was quite an interesting finding. And I should add, this is just in this polling. So, you know, this is just what the Lord Ashcroft survey found of those people that were polled. On the right-hand column, we were trying to ascertain how it was by asking the question or looking at the question, would you support those public sector workers taking strike action? And as you might expect, public support for that does fall off a little bit, although the majority of Labour voters and public sector workers supported public sector workers taking strike action. And I think what we've seen since the general election then is a real move in that debate, and we've seen ministers, including some quite unlikely ones like Joe, signalling a change of direction, saying that it's about time we did start to pay a decent pay rise for public sector workers, in this case nurses. And we saw other ministers moving backward and forwards. Boris Johnson changed his mind about 3 times in the space of a week. And some MPs, Gavin, actually said that government public sector pay policy was actually contributed to him losing his seat in the election. And then in September, we saw the government confirm above pay rises for police and prison officers, and we'll come on to that a bit later. So that's the sort of, I think that's the sort of step by step of what's happened in the political direction of travel over the last 7 years. And what I want to do is just have a look at then what's actually happened to public sector pay over this time. I've got to warn you, there's a few charts here, so bear with me, but I hope this tells quite a clear picture. So the government's pay policy was revealed in a series of budget announcements, starting, as I said earlier, with the June budget in 2010, when we saw a 2-year pay freeze covering the years 2011-12 and 2012-13, as well as a 200% rate increase for public sector workers who are earning less than £21,000 a year. Just to qualify that, we know that in some sectors like local government and some parts of the civil service, that pay freeze started a year earlier, and also £150 for lower paid public sector workers wasn't implemented universally. In the autumn statement 2011, the pay freeze was lifted and replaced with an average 1% cap on public sector pay awards for the next 2 years. That's 2013-14 and 2014-15, and that was then a further 4 years in the summer budget following the general election in 2015. What we should also say during this time is there was other things going on around public sector pay, for example, pay reform in teaching in the civil service, and we also saw another squeeze on public sector workers' income through changes to pensions and significant increases in employee contributions. So what has this meant for real earnings? By real earnings, we mean wages adjusted for increases in the cost of living, inflation. So this table here shows a pretty random selection of different types of public sector occupation. These were based on actual real public sector work that took part in our publicity stunt down in Westminster in July. So that's why we've got quite an eclectic mix of types of occupation here. Just to show you a couple of examples on this chart, so we've seen a band 6 NHS paramedic is around about 4,000, is earning around about £4,000 less in real terms today than they were in 2010. A qualified firefighter is earning around about £3,000 less in terms today than they were in 2010. I just want to say a little bit about the methodology here, because calculating loss of earnings and pay growth is a complicated issue, and there's different ways of doing it. The way we've done it is we look at the actual pay growth for those types of jobs, and we contrast that with what pay would have been had it grown in line with inflation, and then we express what you were earning in 2010 in today's price inflation. So for example, a teacher outside London who might be earning £33,160 today, their pay in 2010 would have been worth over £35,000 in today's prices. Now, the government tend to have a slightly different approach, and they tend to base their figures on the Office for National Statistics annual average wage for public sector workers. So they take a median. The problem with that is it picks up a number of different factors. So for example, if a lot of older workers retire at the top of their pay grade and they're replaced by younger workers at the bottom of their pay grade, the median pay goes up and down accordingly. What we want to do is look at of government pay policy, the pay freeze and the pay cap. So we take these occupations, assume that they're at the top of their pay grade in 2010, and map their growth going forward. So we're just looking at the influence of the pay freeze and the pay cap over the I guess the other thing that's important is the measure of inflation you use. So the government tends to use, for the purposes of this anyway, CPI, which is a lower measure of inflation, which doesn't pick up housing costs. So it might be argued that RPI is a more measure of the actual costs our members face. And if you use RPI, you get much higher losses of earnings using this methodology. We tend to publish both because we want to show what we think the real impact has been, but we also want to use the government's own figures. So we use CPI and RPI. Now, the really important thing to stress is we get in the numbers game, and there's a real human impact behind these numbers. This is real loss of earnings, lowering living standards for millions of public sector workers. And we did a survey again with GQ Research after the election of a group of public sector workers. And these are some really worrying figures here. Around half are worried every day about the expenses and the cost of living. 15% are skipping meals. 20% are cutting back on heating. You know, this is real impacts on real people's lives, and we should always remember that. Now, I want to return to this issue about public versus private sector pay. And what this chart shows you is that we are now seeing a decline in public sector real earnings relative to the earnings in the wider economy. In the immediate aftermath of the global financial crisis and the recession that followed, the green line shows you that earnings in the whole economy, private sector earnings, took a nosedive, while for at least 2 years, or for a year at least, public sector pay held up, largely because of pre-existing negotiated pay agreements that were already in place, but the freeze and the cap kicked in. But as private sector earnings began a slow recovery from 2014 onwards, public sector pay has continued to decline. And what the dotted lines show you here is OBR forecasts. So if public sector pay cap continues, that gap between public sector and earnings in the wider economy is set to grow and intensify. And this is what lies behind, or partly lies behind, the growing recruitment and retention that we're seeing in teaching, in health, in parts of the civil service and elsewhere, as employers are finding it increasingly hard to find and hang on to the staff they need, who are just seeing their pay diminish. Now, as we've pointed out, ministers and some newspapers are quick to portray public sector workers as being paid more than private sector, but this isn't actually the case, because the reason why, when you use an average figure, public sector pay seems to be more than private sector pay, is that because there's so many low paid jobs concentrated in the low wage jobs in areas like retail and hospitality. If you actually compare like for like, so if you take a job in the private sector and a job in the public sector that has similar levels of responsibility, skills, training, you'll find that there's very little difference in pay. In fact, public sector pay is lower. This chart, produced by Income Data Research in the summer of 2016, shows that public and private sector pay generally is comparable, but public sector pay is lower in finance and business services, construction and manufacturing. So there's many areas of the private sector that are paid more than the public sector. The final point I want to make about what's happened to pay in the last 7 years is that this isn't just a bad thing for those public sector workers, it's a bad thing for the wider economy. Pay restraint is taking spending power and wages out of people's pockets and out of local high streets. What it shows is the loss of spending power from economies in different parts of the country between 2010 and 2016. And what we did there, we calculated the average loss of earnings for a public sector worker, and we multiplied it by public sector workers that work in those regions. And what this shows you, for example, is that in Yorkshire and Humber, around about £3 billion worth of spending power was taken out of the Yorkshire and Humber economy over that 6-year period. We're facing sluggish GDP growth, largely based on diminished demand in the economy. You can see that this is actually having a bad effect on economic growth. So I just want to finish this presentation now by dwelling quickly on where next. And as I said, in last month, or this month in fact, the government had confirmed that the police officers would be awarded a 2% rise, although half of that was just a one-off payment, so what we call an unconsolidated pay rise, and prison officers received a 1.7% pay rise. And a lot of play was made by ministers. This was breaking the pay cap. There was a lot of anger from public sector unions in response to this. Why, you might ask? After all, this has broken the pay cap. Well, we have three really big problems with this. The first is that with CPI inflation at 2.9%, let's not forget that these are pay cuts. This year, prison officers were awarded a pay cut. Prison officers were awarded a pay cut along with all other public sector workers. So that's point number one. Point number two is that, as Liz Truss, the Chief Secretary of the Treasury, announced, there would be no extra funding to departmental budgets to cope with this pay rise. So these are budgets that are already stretched to the absolute limit, and those employers are going to have to find the additional money. Those pay rises are not funded. And the third situation now is that we have teachers, or most teachers and most teachers and NHS workers having to live within the cap this year, and other types of public sector worker getting cap. And we think that public sector workers across the board should be given above pay awards above the cap. So we're seeing a cherry picking of different occupations and a division between different types of public sector workers, which we find unacceptable. What do we actually want then? Well, in earlier this month, Frances O'Grady, the TUC's General Secretary, wrote an article in the Times where she set out the 5 key tests to see as part of a fair pay deal for the public sector. So the first of those is a point I just made: remove the pay cap for all public service workers. That's those public service workers covered by pay review bodies, those covered by direct bargaining, such as local government. They should all be awarded above the pay cap. back office, frontline staff, support staff, across the board. The public sector is a team, public service workers are a team, and they've all. The second point we'd make is that we want the freedom for employers and trade unions to determine appropriate pay awards for their sectors. Now that might be through a pay review body process for those workers that are covered by it, such as teachers, workers, or it might be through collective bargaining in the civil service or local government or other areas. The point being is that this should be about an independent process based on negotiation and pay determination between employers and unions for their. We don't think it should be dictated by mandarins at the Treasury and Whitehall. The third point we'd make is that the autumn budget, a Chancellor must use the autumn budget to provide the new money to fund pay awards. As I said, public sector budgets are already stretched to the limit. We're seeing NHS providers increasingly in deficit. We need new pay awards funded from new money from the Treasury. And the fourth point we'd make is, if you're a public sector worker, you could be earning around about £3,000 less in real terms now than you were in 2010. Pay awards in line with inflation is one thing, but we think we should start making up for that loss of pay as well. So any pay awards we want to see need to be above inflation in order to start addressing that shortfall in earnings since 2010. We need to eradicate poverty pay, and that means that no public service worker should be paid less than the real living wage, which is over £9 in London and around about £8.50 elsewhere. So those are our 5 key tests, and that's what we're campaigning for going ahead. Is this affordable? Well, the first point we would make is we afford not to do it. We've seen a crisis in morale, recruitment and retention. The idea of not paying a decent and fair pay rise for public sector workers means that gets worse. And the IFS, the Institute, said as much in their latest report published last week, that the opportunity cost, or the cost of not paying an above 1% pay rise, means a growing crisis of employers in the public sector not being able to get the right staff. So how much will it cost to pay a pay rise? Well, the IFS did a bit of work around the time of the election, and they looked at plans in each of the manifestos, and they looked at the Labour and Lib Dem manifestos, and they costed them out. And what they came up with was that to pay public sector workers in line, all public sector workers in line with inflation, would cost somewhere in the region of 4 billion extra a year by 2019-20, and workers in line with forecasted growth in private sector earnings would cost closer to 6 billion additional a year by 2019-20. Now that sounds like a lot of money, 6 billion, but that represents actually less than 2% of total government departmental budgets. So we're not, I think that is affordable. That 6 billion should also be contrasted with 20 billion that the government has lost in revenue as a result of cutting corporation tax to amongst the lowest in the OECD. So that shows the comparable figures in terms of paying public sector workers or cutting. So what's the TUC doing about it? Well, we've been campaigning for a long time now, calling for an end to the public sector pay cap, calling for fair pay for public sector workers around those 5. Been out in constituencies around the country over the last 12 months lobbying MPs, and we're bringing that together in Westminster on Tuesday the 17th of October. There's a march, there's a rally in Westminster in Parliament Square that evening. There's a lot that afternoon, and in addition there's a dozen different local rallies in different towns and cities across the country, and we hope to see that reflected by some sort of movement in the budget. We're also meeting with a roundtable with the Chancellor himself and Liz Truss, his number 2 at the Treasury, later in October. And like I said, we're hoping to see some proper movement in the budget in November. But if that doesn't happen, we will just continue to campaign, continue to fight and continue to lobby. And we hope you can join us with that. Thank you very much for your time, and I'm happy to take any questions. Okay, so I've got a few questions in already. The first one is from Ben Martin. What can trade unions do to work better together locally on the issue of pay? Well, obviously in most sectors, the unions have worked very closely at a national level, putting in joint pay claims. So we've seen a 5% claim go in jointly from unions in local government. Revealed their pay claim last week, and unions are obviously going to work together to publicise that to their members at a local level. We also think that unions can work locally to influence and get together and lobby and to mobilise effectively for some of the regional campaigns and rallies. So I think there's an awful lot that we can see unions doing together locally. Ben, if you want to clarify that question and ask me a bit more, then feel free to get back into carry on that conversation. The next question is from Anne-Marie, who's asking us, when we say public sector workers, are we referring to direct frontline staff only, or are we including directors and CEOs? Well, you know, at the TUC, we speak on behalf of those unions affiliated to the TUC, and we cover workers across the board. Some of them will be frontline uniformed service workers, others will be support staff in a range of different roles. And some, yes, some will be senior civil servants, some will be NHS managers. We don't differentiate between them. This isn't just about low pay. This isn't just about emergency service workers. This is about all public sector workers who have all worked hard and all deserve a pay rise and are all subject to what we think is an unfair restriction. So it doesn't matter whether they, what level of pay they have or what job they perform in the public sector. If they're members of our unions, we're speaking on their behalf because they've all been subject to, as I said, an unfair and arbitrary restriction on pay that makes little sense. A question from Anne-Marie again about protection of final salary pensions. Of course, because pensions is a part of the overall pay package. A couple of points on that. We have obviously seen massive changes to public sector pensions, and we continue the fight to protect those pension schemes. We are already seeing those pensions change for the worse, although we fought in 2011 and achieved some significant concessions as well. But on the whole, public sector workers are paying more in as employee contributions, getting slightly less out in many cases, and are working longer to get those pensions. So yes, they are under attack, and we will continue to campaign for. I've lost the picture here, sorry. One also make is that, as you saw with a quote with Philip Hammond and other ministers are saying that, well, while we've repressed pay, it doesn't matter because public sector workers still get their final salary pensions. The point that we've made is that you can't eat your lunch on a pension. We're talking about income now, not in the future. There's a pay and a cost of living that needs to be addressed through the pay you receive, not necessarily the pension you're going to receive. And also, as we said, we've already made huge sacrifices on those pensions, and we're already paying more in. Well, another question from Adam, a question from Adam Peacock. Given that the government is so hostile to unions, such as the Trade Union Act, how can we work around this? And would it ever be deemed acceptable to operate outside of the law? Well, I think strike action is a last resort. It's always a last resort, and there's other things we can be doing in the meantime. I think we've shown actually through the Trade Union Act and other campaigns that we can lobby, we can campaign, and we can win public support, and we can bring pressure to bear on ministers and backbench MPs. There's a whole lot of things that we can do that don't involve. But ultimately, it's for members to judge for themselves what they think they need to do to continue to put pressure on the government to deliver on public sector pay, and industrial action may figure in those considerations, and union members may support that in certain situations. We've had discussions about that nationally with unions about strategy around that. I think it might well be that we need to take a more strategic view and put resources into those. I mean, if industrial action, if members do support industrial action, it might be might be effective to be a bit more strategic about that and putting places where you are going to get over ballot thresholds. But I think it's going to you're going to have a flexible and strategic approach to. Okay, so a question from John Taylor. Ministers have been trying to muddle progression payments with annual pay awards to suggest that individual public sector workers' pay have risen by more than 1% each year. And interviewers haven't really challenged them on this. Is TUC doing anything to nail this argument? Yeah, well, we make this case all the time. We say that the top of a pay band is the rate for the job, and everything that a worker gets in terms of progressing to that pay band is a way of them building year by year to the rate for the job with incremental progression to it based on the experience and skills that they acquire along the way. So we do make that case. We don't include progression in the argument around public sector pay because, as we said, we just think that's a way of achieving step by step a pathway to getting the natural rate for the job, which is the top of the pay band. Another question from Adam Peacock. Does the TUC feel the same principles on pay apply to trade union employers? And if such a stance is not taken, would the TUC make clear this is not acceptable within its own mechanisms? Well, I think that trade union employers will work representing their members to bargain and determine relevant pay awards for their members. It's not for the TUC to dictate or inform unions about how they should handle their own pay negotiations with the unions that represent their staff. I think that's all we've got in terms of questions that have been put in at the moment. Well, thank you very much for your time. Hopefully as many of you as possible can join us on the 17th of October in Westminster. Come and lobby your MP, come and join in the march and rally, and join the rallies that are taking place all over the region. Come to the TUC all over the country, come to the TUC website, and you will see details on about our public sector pay campaign. Thank you for your time. Cheers.